about something, just ask it then. Don't feel like you need to wait till the end. Because, like I said, I am going to move through it fast for the sake of time. And then I know on my end, Chris's mic was cutting out a little bit. So if I cut out and you want me to like repeat something, just let me know
Yeah.
and I'll go back over it. Okay, so again, this snowballed on me a little bit. It was just going to be brief and it became pretty extensive, but the idea is like a power development methodology and then kind of data analytics that anybody can run. Um, so I just finished Devin McConnell's book, which is basically like approachable sports science, like what kind of sports science um, can we do, with limited application or limited funds. So sort of a similar vein. So this is a Jim Wendler quote that I just have always really liked. When you're writing a program, you should be able to explain exactly what each exercise is, what it does, why you're doing it, why you chose the sets and reps you did. If you can't, your program is worthless. So again, just like we want to be able to say that our program works, and that can be very difficult. Obviously, um, we've talked about the lack of evaluation for strength and conditioning coaches and departments, but we should at least strive to evaluate ourselves. So what do we care about? We care about winning, and KPIs are our best guess. So as I did this, I really realized that we should be dividing KPIs into sport KPIs and weight room KPIs. So velo, exit velocity would be sport KPIs, and 30-yard sprint could be considered a training KPI unless it's taken in game. Um, and then, in my opinion, I read this somewhere this past year, and I really believe in it. I think it's really helps me organize my thoughts. There's two ways to create a better athlete. That's being able to get into a position and being able to create power out of that position. I mean, really, when you think about it, like it doesn't matter if you're training a sprinter, we want them to get their thigh up to the optimal angle and we want them to be able to accelerate it down quickly. A hockey player, we want them to be able to do whatever, right? It's all about getting in positions and creating power out of those positions. And then finally, talking about KPIs, a equals B equals C equals D. So if D is winning a game, there's research that will show you, well, when your forwards cover 6,000 meters a game, you're more likely to win the game. Okay, so that's C is covering 6,000 meters. B, what do we need to do to get our athletes to cover 6,000 meters? So maybe that's tempo runs, whatever. Okay, well, before we can do tempo runs, we need to have mobility, whatever it is. Those are just three things that I think are great foundational philosophies for improving KPIs. So before we get into power development, and this is more of a review, just to kind of set everything up, we need some sort of movement evaluation. Again, you have to be able to get into the position that's required. That can be anything from a bio sway to watching them squat. I do believe that qualitative movement evaluations are valuable. It doesn't have to be quantitative. And then I think you need to define your positions for your sport, your athletes, what's important, what are you doing in the weight room, etc. Then you need some sort of strength evaluation. Again, that could be anything from an isometric mid-thigh pull on a force plate to a back squat. I do think there's a lot of value in an isometric mid-thigh pull. It doesn't have to be on a force plate. You could use a strain gauge or a luggage scale. But the reason for that, and we'll get that, we'll explain more of this as we get into data analytics, but the reason for that is the back squat has a moderately high level of technical demands. Like I think we can all agree that teams have bad squatters on them, right? But there are no bad mid thigh pullers. Like it's literally yanking a bar in the most advantageous position. Like the technique is removed, so you can get an actual gauge of strength regardless of technical capacities. And then as we get into data analytics, I'll talk about why it's nice to have a strength measure outside of an exercise that you train, such as back squat. But obviously, the double body weight squat metric we've all heard before. Just was on the Zoom call with Brian Mann. He talked about 1.8 times body weight has 0.5 to 0.7 coefficient of transfer. What does that mean? I couldn't really tell you, but he made it sound small. I called Dr. Zordos, asked him about effect sizes and coefficient of transfer, and he said that he didn't like coefficient of transfer, that I wasn't very reliable. So I don't know. Again, it sounds like that means 1.8 body weight squat, there's a decreased return. He then said that 2.2 times body weight has very little to negative return. Obviously, we know that if we pursue strength forever, like there's a negative return on that. We're expending energy on something that's no longer advantageous. But we'll go into the minutia of those two numbers. When I started writing this on this slide, I was bought in. I was about ready to stop strength training. I was like, if you hit 2.2, you're freaking done. But as I completed it, I'll show you kind of where I got lost in the weeds and where that changed my thinking. So obviously, you also need body composition. I was thinking about this, like if you got a huge guy, there might, he might need to lose weight to be more powerful. There is an effective body composition. And then finally, talking about does strength matter? There's a guy named Burl Caraway. He's a closer for Dallas Baptist baseball. He came in, one of the weakest, most frail-looking human beings I've ever seen. He threw 91 miles an hour from the left, touched 92 of that freshman year, jumped 41 and a half inches. So I asked Adam, I was like, Adam, does strength matter? Like, this guy is whippy, he's explosive, like can we develop power without developing strength? And you guys know me, that wasn't for it wasn't like I didn't want to develop strength. I was just asking. And he's like, well, obviously this guy hasn't strength trained and he throws 91 miles an hour and jumps 41 and a half inches. Like, you can look at high school athletes. Well, that was the case that freshman year. He spent 3 years strength training. One of his main faults was a weak front leg in his delivery. He spent 3 years strength training, and now he throws 99 miles an hour from the left. So that's a long anecdote to explain. I have no idea. I don't know if strength matters. Okay. Methods for power development, ballistic lifting. That would be like Olympic lifting, squat jumps, dynamic effort method, things like that. One thing I've always wondered is Pmax, and why does that matter? So that would be like the optimal load at which power is peaked. So for the bench press, let's say it's 40%. For most people, 40% is where we see their peak power output. That would be their Pmax. But like, why does that matter? I started to ask myself. And there's no clinical explanation. The research is really, really bad. But essentially the thought would be that we train at high forces to develop high force production. And so we're going to train at high power outputs to develop high power output. That would be the general thinking of why it's important. And I do believe that there's a huge time and place for it, but I don't think we need to be married to the optimal load. Plyometrics and sprinting, phasic focuses, that would be triphasic training and K-box, essentially. Post-activation potentiation, and then upper body considerations. I think upper body power development is quite different from lower body. Okay, so of course we have to talk about Olympic lifting versus powerlifting. Here are your numbers. Those are wattages. Wattage is essentially the measure of power output, so force times velocity. So you have 200 kilos on a bar and you move it at 2 meters per second. I don't know what that gives you, but let's say 2,000 watts. Okay. So this is essentially the numbers you see. Can you guys see my mouse?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So these are obviously 100%, right? They're world records. You see 3,000 watts, 3,000 watts. Your super heavyweights are going to pull 3,600 watts. Jerks up to 4,700. But also your peak power, like we talked about, your Pmax is actually at 80%. So let's bump these up, 10, 20%. Let's say the jerk maybe gets up to 5,500 and snatches get up to like 4,000 maybe. I don't know, to be generous. It doesn't matter. They're going to get smashed. Okay. And, up to your super heavyweights that weigh 300 pounds. This is a really, really good study done out of App State with sprinters, jumpers, and football players. It's our population. The methods were actually done well, which is not something that's common in our industry. They used 2 Tendo units on a bar to adjust for horizontal displacement. They covered their bases. Like, this was a very good study that I think that you can hang your hat on. And so we can see that squatting, this was dynamic effort intent, speed intent. Your max load is going to be somewhere, I'm going to say this is like 70%. And, our peak power is about 3,500 watts. Again, we can be generous because it's going to get smashed. We see the power clean. This optimal load is 80%. That's consistent with other literature, and their power output is, almost 5,000. But again, it doesn't really matter. It's going to get demolished. We see the jump squat body weight is the optimal load. So no bar on your back is the optimal load for peak power. And this is where that conversation about like, well, does peak power optimal load matter? Sort of. Anyways, we can see that jumping outputs, 6,500 watts. With a light load, we're still looking at above 5,000 watts. So if you care about peak power, this should be like a clear answer to you. Like, you should be jump squatting. If that's what you care about, peak power output, you should be jumping and jump squatting, and these should be like strength speed exercises. I don't think that peak power is the end all be all though. So hex bar versus barbell jumps, I think this is important to talk about. And again, this isn't a conversation of like, well, which one am I going to use? Like, use them all. You don't have to like pick one cookie from the basket. You use them all. But just going back, we saw that bodyweight jumping at about 6,000. Here, this was rugby union players who were not that strong. Their jumping power was more like 4,000. I don't know if that's a discrepancy in testing methods or what. But even if they're arbitrary numbers, we can see that the hex bar jump output, 10% more, or maybe more like 7 or 8%, but that's still significant. And the squat jump was slightly less. This is at 20% of 1 RM. So I still think there's a ton of value to doing loaded jumping. And another takeaway from this is that the hex bar jump is a more advantageous position than a bar on your back. These changes in power can be accounted via velocity, which just means that we're still on a force velocity curve, right? So if load goes up, velocity goes down more than load goes up, okay? This is pro rugby players doing a hex bar jump squat. They have relative peak power, which is really annoying because that's a useless metric. But let's say we take the worst guy, 50 kilo or watts per kilo. Well, their average body weight in the study was 98 kilos. So even the worst player is producing 5,000 watts on a hex bar jump. That's pretty good. Okay. Velocity-based training. So we have our velocity zones from very, very fast, very light to maximal effort. Okay. These zones, you see 1.3, 1.3 to 1. Those are mean velocities. So if you ever have a tendo, this chart is based off of mean velocities. You're going to use mean velocity for powerlifting, and you're going to use peak velocity for Olympic lifting. Because we don't work with Olympic weightlifters, they have poor technique. The mean velocity is going to be affected by their ability to pull under the bar. So we don't want that. We just want power. So we're going to look at peak power, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Then just talking about tendo units in general, Lord knows I'm like the biggest proponent of tendo units. Let's say you don't even want to do velocity-based training. The tendo unit still has significant increase in outputs of training. So this is velocity-based training, but let's look at the group that could see their tendo, the feedback group, versus the group who had a tendo attached, but it was turned backwards so they couldn't see it. Okay. This group started off as less powerful, and they had a larger percent change. Okay, larger percent change, extremely larger percent change, again, very significant, and massive percent change. Okay, so we can see that just having feedback, and I think we can all think of examples of this, is very, very powerful. Again, in the 30-meter sprint, they had a negative 0.46 effect size. We'll talk about how massive that is, but it's huge. Okay, that's like, this was like a 6-week intervention or something. That's ridiculous to have that much change in a 30-meter sprint is absurd. Okay. Well, why do we even care about velocity-based training? If we looked at this dashed line, we can see that heavy resistance strength-trained individuals are stronger. Right, that makes sense. Okay. Then in our solid line, we have untrained people. And then our dotted line, we have explosively trained people. This is BVT-based training. Somewhere in the middle, that makes sense. They're not using as heavy weights. But if you go to this junction here, okay, 200 milliseconds, why does that matter? Well, that's the average long contact time of a body weight movement, sprinting or jumping, right? I think jumping is like 2,500. Sprinting, it should be less than 200, I believe. But you can see that ballistically trained athletes produce more force at that time. So why do we strength train? We strength train to produce force. That's the whole point. But we don't have 500 milliseconds to produce that force. We have 200, right? So that's why this dynamic effort training is important. And I'd actually be really interested to know what we would consider our times to peak force in baseball. You know, a windup is, Andrew, you could tell me better, but what's a windup, like a second and a half? You know, a swing would be, you know, where do you start it? Do you start it at the bat on shoulder? Whatever. Anyways, minutia, but we care about rate of force development, not just overall force. Okay. So, well, what do we do with velocity-based training? Essentially, we're going to surf the curve. We're going to work here, and we're going to work faster, right? That would be the simplest, most no-nonsense method. Brian Mann spoke on strength speed and speed strength not being the same trait. And I thought that was an important distinction that I hadn't heard before. He just talked about these are two separate traits, just like max strength and max speed are two separate traits. And referenced some Soviet literature. But he said for easy implementation, he would start working in strength speed, and then he would work in speed strength. Jeff Jones at App State, I overheard in a conversation that he does reverse lunges for speed. He starts at 185, then 205, then 225. That's week 1, week 2, week 3. For speed, he repeats that cycle, and you have to be faster. And his thing is like, voila, we got you more explosive because you're moving this weight faster.
I was going to say too, Dennis, that I've seen, and I talked to Cam Joss about it, about they use the Pit Shark or like a belt squat machine for speed.
Yeah.
And they were just using that because it was like a safe option too, and they were talking about the same concept.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen that, and I know Blaine does it. One thing I've never done but I got really sold on during this project is velo drop. So let's say you're doing 3 sets. Well, rather than saying 3 sets of 3, you're doing 3 sets, as many reps as possible before you lose 20% of our desired velocity. So we know that 80% correlates to something like 0.6 meters per second. What's 20% off 0.6? I don't know. Let's say 0.5. So you're doing 3 sets, as many reps as you can above 0.5. When you hit 0.5, you're done. Okay. We know that percentage-based training, that we're going to see a 40% loss in velocity. Like, think about how slow the 8th rep on a set of 8 is, right? It's slow. So there was significantly greater 2x fiber development. I can't believe that they convinced these people to do muscle biopsies, but apparently they did. I mean, if there's anything you care about, it should be 2x fiber development. I think that's a really powerful result of this study. And then the CMJ counter movement jump increased significantly, right? So we're not talking it just improved, but significantly to a clinical eye, it improved in a small sample size. That means a lot, okay? Velocity-based training prescription, it could be as simple as like dynamic effort stuff, 8 sets of 2 at a given velocity. This is what I've always done when I've had tendos. It's easy. You just know what range you want to work in, and you give them a number, you vary the number. The one thing I'll say is that the first rep of a set is almost always slower than the desired velocity. I never prescribe singles for VBT. You can, but just know that in every single set of velocity-based training I've ever observed, the second rep is much faster than the first. I don't know why that is. I would guess it's a PAP effect, but no one has ever looked at it. Okay. And then auto regulation. We know that people's percentages move. Brian Mann referenced a really cool self study at Missouri where people's maxes moved like 20%, both above and below over the course of 3 weeks. So you can auto regulate based on velocity training zones. Okay. These are velocities for Olympic lifting. Again, these are actually mean velocities, but they're mean velocities of Olympic level weightlifters. And Olympic level weightlifters, their mean and peak velocities of a movement are nearly identical. So I would reference these as peak velocities when talking about athletes, but it is descriptive based on height. All right, going to blow through that. And then VBT validity, we talked about the 20% velocity loss group. Well, that was versus a 40% velocity loss group. This is percentage-based training versus 20% velocity loss group. And so again, you're prescribing a velocity, and then when they lose 20% of the desired velocity, they stop that set. Okay, everything was equalized, same sets, same exercises, same frequency, same duration. The only difference was like 3 sets of 8 at 70%, and the VLOS group did 3 sets of as many reps as possible until you lose your velocity, and then did a correlating velocity to 70%. The velocity loss group had significantly less volume. I didn't include that chart, but they did. It was probably like 20% less over the entire study. And we can see that they outperformed their peers significantly. Effect size 0.59, 0.44. A larger effect size is better. 6, 5, 3, 8, 2. We can see a significant difference, right? One weird thing they randomly referenced in the results section of this paper, that there may have been a 3-second eccentric. I don't know. They never talked about that otherwise. Okay. And then we talked about jump squatting. Like, we know that it produces 6,500 to 5,000 watts at various loads. I would jump squat with certain populations, but not all of them. We're taking people that might not have great landing mechanics and adding load to the system. That's probably not desirable. Excuse me. Probably not desirable in a ton of populations and in early development, right? We go back to Burl Caraway. I'm not going to load that guy. He weighed 120 pounds. He had never been in a weight room before. He's whippy. I don't want to lose that quality, but I'm not going to jump squat him because I'm not adding load to somebody that can't handle his body weight, right? So what do? we add chains. Okay, squatting against chains, I could not find a study on it. I'm a firm believer that you're going to see power. Well, it's because it's impossible to study. The load of the system is moving constantly, and so it's literally impossible to quantify the power outputs. So we just have to use our brains, right? We know that dynamic effort squatting produces like 3,000 to 4,000 watts, and that jump squatting produces 6,000 watts. What's the difference? The difference is that the load is obviously lighter, but and actually it wasn't, because the dynamic effort squats in that study worked down to 0%. But the difference is that we leave the ground. We're accelerating through triple extension in order to combat gravity, right? That's a jump squat. That's literally, you're jumping with the squat. So how do we recreate that in safer means? We add accommodating resistance, okay? During a normal squat without accommodating resistance, every single human being on this planet will decelerate the bar. Decelerate the bar. That is not what we want. At critical triple extension points, every human being will decelerate the bar. Okay, we're only accelerated for the first like 80% of the movement. If we continue to accelerate, the bar would leave our back and it would crush our spine on the way back down, right? Well, we add chains. Chains combat gravity for you. So now you have to accelerate the bar through the point of triple extension, obviously replicating sport movement. How does that work? Well, gravity is an accelerative component of physics, and now we're adding chains which combat that, right? So the weight gets heavier as we go up, heaviest at the top. That way we have to continue to accelerate through the point triplets. Okay. Again, it's not just one. I would do both. Plyometrics. Vertical jump correlates to everything. Here's club head speed. So that means how fast does a golfer swing a golf club? These are not elite measures by any means, but we can see that, and these are obviously not elite jumps, but we can see that the counter movement jump correlates to club head speed. I mean, how much further do you want me to get from a vertical jump, right? And then obviously it correlates to sprinting. And then I was really surprised how strongly it correlated to the T-test. That kind of blew me away. And these double stars mean that it's to a 0.01 significance, which is very, very strong, right? That means like, wow, this really correlates, okay? I wouldn't have guessed that. Here we have vertical jump correlating to exit velocity, and this is height. So we see like there's probably a trend. It probably looks something like this, okay? And then we calculate power versus exit velocity, and then we start to see a real trend. We'll get into this with the data analytics, but if your sporting movement that you're trying to correlate does not involve displacement of the body, swinging, serving, anything like that, you want to look at power. You don't want to look at height. If you're looking at displacement of the body, sprinting, speed, jump height, whatever, you want to look at actual height and displacement. Okay. So plyometric validity, do plyometrics work? I think we can all agree that, like, yes, they do, but just have some research, they do. Two takeaways: intensity of session. I don't know how they measured this, but I would guess that it meant drop height. High intensity had a much, much larger effect than did moderate or low intensity. Okay. Again, there's a place for everything, but we should be working to get to a high intensity. 1.2 effect size, that's like massive, guys. That's like we're going to probably look at 400 effect sizes today, and you're going to see, I think, 4 that are above 1.2. Okay, like a 1.2 effect size is very large. And then again, what type of plyometric exercise? Well, obviously, don't choose one, do them all. 1.46 versus 0.6, more than double in effect size. That is like, I can't even explain to you how powerful that is. Okay. How much volume do we need? This was a low volume group. They did 40 repetitions, or the high volume group quadrupled that, right? Just to see a real difference. We want to have a big difference. Very standard, what you would expect: tuck jumps, 2-foot hurdle jumps, broad jumps, and then bounding, right? A normal volume versus a high volume. And looking at it, it's hard to say who improved more, right? We see low volume group stronger here, low volume group stronger here, low volume group stronger here. But when you look at the effects, like I wouldn't go so strong as to say that the low volume really was king. Well, let's talk about training economy. We're limited to 60-hour sessions. This high volume group that probably took 30 to 40 minutes. The point of this study is that you don't need more than 40 reps, right? You look at the NSCA text, it tells you need 120 reps or something. That's just not true. It's just poor research or translation. Okay. Protocols, how would I implement it? This is from Mike Young. It's a simple way to quantify low mechanical load, aka easy to high mechanical load. How high is the fall? Is it low, medium, high? How fast is it? None. I believe this is referencing the counter movement. So this would be like a seated box jump, a controlled eccentric, and then a normal plyometric. Rigidity of the landing, is it soft? Are you landing quiet, or are you trying to slap the ground? Okay. And then obviously bilateral to unilateral landings. This could be something asymmetric, could be something like, you land in a split or something. Okay. This is how I'm going to plan to do my plyometrics this year. I've always used a 30-inch hurdle. I'm getting away from that. I don't believe that athletes that max vertical jump is 30 should be jumping over a 30-inch hurdle anymore. Okay, that was something I opened my eyes to. So this year I'm going to start them down with like a 21 for girls, and probably more like a 24 to 27 with guys. Stick and stabilize for 2 weeks. Then we're going to go multiple response for 2 weeks. That's like a mini bounce on the ground. Again, changing this. Before I go to continuous, we're going to go depth to double. So that would be a low box depth jump into 2 hurdles. Okay, and why am I doing this? Well, I started to think, like, what's the difference? Why am I adding this depth drop to a hurdle jump? Like, the hurdle landing itself is already a depth drop, right? The body is falling from 30 inches, and I'm setting up this freaking 14-inch depth box. Like, what am I doing? I'm spinning my wheels. So starting down that thought process, I realized we should be adding the depth drop as a regression. This should be building the system to do 5 hurdles continuously in a dynamic depth drop for 5 times, right? So that's why that's there. Also, saw Kennesaw State doing single hurdle drops, and I just thought to myself, like, wow, like, so easy, like, it makes sense, like, what a great regression. Like, it was a hurdle jump, you walked 5 steps and you had your next hurdle, right? Develop the system simply. And then finally adding height to our hurdle jumps, and then you start to cue them differently for speed off the ground. Okay, box jumps, static seated box jump, that's something that I've found to be very important in athletes that I've never used before. I think that weak athletes and poor jumpers need more overload on the concentric portion of the jump. And just anecdotally, that worked really well for my golfers. I'm going to load it before I do standing, again, to overload the concentric portion. And then we're going to introduce our eccentric actions before we load the true variation. And then just some single leg continuums. Okay, sprinting. Does sprinting work? This is simply just a sprinting versus jumping versus weight training study. And we can see that, like, yeah, they all work. And that wasn't to say that sprinting isn't important, but like, I just feel like I don't need to cover it. I think we all agree that sprinting increases sprinting. Okay. So phasic training, again, this is mostly triphasic. Here's the triphasic model. We're looking at the blue is a less powerful athlete. Their time to ballistic, their time to leaving the ground is longer than an elite athlete, right? This is time on the x-axis. And we can see that the curve is flatter, not to be ironic, but and that our elite athlete is more down and up, right? Like, it's more like get in, get out, let's go. And Cal just theorized that this was the difference of elite athletes and advanced athletes. And he did have force plate data to back this up. That being said, Cal has a ton of like good anecdotal evidence in his book. He talks about, like, oh, my tennis team, their t-test improved this, and he provides his own data analytics, but at the same time, there's like very little like true good clinical research on triphasic training. In fact, I think there's no research on triphasic training. There is some research on eccentric training. And then I've had some really smart coaches that I value say that his research interpretation in his book was really bad. I don't know if that's true, but the point is, I don't know. Okay, here's an eccentric training program. Um, 20 Division III track and field athletes. They all performed the same like linear progression program. One group did velocity-based training. The other group did velocity-based training, but with an eccentric additive, whatever you want to say. Okay, right? 3-second eccentric. But they were still trying to get fast up. 12 weeks, so this is a long enough study to see an effect, 3 to 4 times a week. Good frequency, deloads every 4th week. This was also during an off season, right? Like pretty well designed study. And we can see that they both work. Okay. Again, I don't know. So looking at this now, 12 resistance trained men. This wasn't an intervention. This was just a correlation study. So they had them do a force plate squat or pull. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. And then they had them do a counter movement jump on a force plate. And they just looked at the force properties. The point is, peak eccentric force was higher correlated to counter movement jump power and height than concentric force was. So we know that the eccentric quality is important, right? This backs up Cal's point. And then concentric power, believe it or not, is important, right? But the point is, it's just not as important from this study in this group. Okay, K-box works. That's the entirety of my point there. I think that Mark proved that to us. He had some really good stuff. He seems like a smart enough guy to control his own data. I believe him. Okay. If I was going to use phasic training, triphasic training, I've used it twice in my career. Neither time have I felt that my athletes came back from it more powerful. Okay, so that's my anecdotal evidence. I believe that it works. I just don't believe that it works as it's written. I think that honestly, I think that Cal may have been a little deceitful in some of his protocols he wrote out. That or my athletes are a lot freaking weaker and mentally softer than his are. But in any case, here's a tempo progression from a guy down in Miami, actually, and I think this is great. So we have a controlled squat, essentially, 2-second down, 1-second pause, 1-second up. That's like a pretty normal tempo. And then literally the next one, you're just not pausing in the bottom. So now we do have a stretch shortening component. The next one, he's loading the eccentric, loading the eccentric, and now we start to see explosive concentric. Again, there's a 4-second controlled down, so we are loading the stretch shortening cycle because there is no controlled pause, but it's slow, so the loading is going to be less than a fast eccentric. Okay, here we see the eccentric gets faster, the concentric is still explosive, but we introduce a pause again in order to. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. In order to not demand too much of the stretch shortening cycle. And then finally, we have rapid eccentrics. Cal does this, rapid isometrics. Cal does this during week 4, 5, and 6. I don't believe that my athletes are ready for that by then. So this is another reason I like that it's last. I do believe it's important. He talks about you shouldn't, on your isometric phase, you shouldn't be slow into the hole. You should drop and hit the brakes. I do think that's important, but I think that, maybe they're not ready by week 4. Okay. Post-activation potentiation. I can tell you that it works. This is my study. Effect size 1.19 at the optimal time, and in the women 0.98, I believe, at the optimal time. Okay. Post-activation, what is it? We don't know. There's 3 theories. I think they're all bull crap. We have no idea. We don't know how it works. Okay. That's the moral of the story. It does work. It does work. Like a 1.2 effect size does not come out of nowhere. It works. Okay. This was an isometric mid-thigh pull with varying rest times before going into a block power clean. So we tried to replicate the movements as closely as we could. and then do something ballistic, we saw a great improvement in wattage. Okay. My point also is there's a negative effect size at 60 seconds. So post-activation potentiation is not some magic thing. You just tell your athletes to squat and box jump. Okay. Like you might think like, okay, Dennis did a study on PAP. Why doesn't he do more of it? Because it's hard to do in a training setting.
Yeah.
Like you see, if you do it at the wrong time, you're going to have a negative effect on your athlete's power output, right? So I do it 3 weeks a year is when I actually control for PAP. I do complex training, but I don't call it PAP because it's not. Okay. What would I do it, or how would I do it? I would do it on strong, proficient athletes, typically males. Very few female athletes are strong enough to need post-activation potentiation or to respond to it positively. There's a negative correlation with the strength of the athlete and how strong they respond to PAP, just meaning strong athletes, it works better, okay? I would do it on a clock. I would have them lift, 45-second timer, and I would hold them at the explosive movement until I tell them to say go at 45 or 90 seconds. Okay. I would use heavy potentiating loads above 80%. I see people post like goblet squats talking about post-activation potentiation. You're wrong. You're incorrect. I don't know what to tell you. Okay. I would do 2 to 4 reps. Again, we talked about why I don't like singles for power development. I wouldn't go above 4. Some people do. Some people do. Me personally, I wouldn't go above 4. Hypothetically, it doesn't make sense to me. Lower body responds better to PAP than upper body. You can try it, but you got to be really strong with your upper body to get an effect. And then you want things to be similar. You just want transfer. Again, an isometric mid-thigh pull and a high hang clean. You just want to get them as close as you can. Okay. This is French contrast method. This is let's see. Yeah, this is one of like the few really good studies I appreciate in our industry. 31 recreational soccer players. They were pretty strong though, so I don't know how recreational they truly were. They also had a 30 above. They had to have above a 30-centimeter jump, which I thought was a cool inclusion criteria. They did 3 sets of 3 with the 3-second pause, 85% squat, but to like I'm gonna guess this is like a quarter squat. Then they did let's call this 25-inch depth jump. They did a 50% body weight dynamic squat, and they did, let's say 25, 30-inch hurdles. And then they did a vertical jump test. So their French contrast method actually was trying to potentiate acutely a vertical jump, which I had never thought of doing it like that before. Does it work? Heck yeah, it does. Okay. This is also the p-value. So how significant was it? It was very significant. Trial 1, 5% increase in vertical jump, 6% increase in vertical jump, 7% increase in vertical jump. They listed the best jump. I don't really know what that means. I don't know if this is like, oh, we take the best of the 3 and compare them, but it doesn't matter. It works really, really strong. Here's your control group. We can see that it does actually work. Okay. This is French contrast method chronically. They did like 6 weeks of French contrast method to see what the outcome would be after multiple sessions, after a training intervention. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is French contrast method compared to the same exact protocol, but it's complex training rather than French contrast method. So this French contrast study was actually a replication study where they took a complex method evaluation and they just plugged it into French contrast, which is a really cool idea. Okay. And then they said, suck it, ours works better. Okay. And that's what this chart is. This is the chronic one. So this was like 6 weeks or something. Yeah, 6 weeks of French contrast method. We can see that the athletes weren't too strong. They did get stronger. We can see this here. What is that? Plus 10 kilos, up to like a pretty acceptable body weight squat ratio. So it does get stronger. And then looking at power outputs, their jump height went from 33, again, centimeters, these are not freaks, 33 to 37. I would call that pretty good. I would say that worked, right? 0.63, that's a good effect size. We've just seen a bunch of like super high ones, but you should still be impressed by that. And then relative peak power. So again, watts per kilo. Okay, upper body considerations. Dan Baker is like one of the only people that's looked into this because he's probably one of the only people that has strong enough bench pressers to care. And he showed that you can get a PAP effect in strong rugby players. So you can see here, again, just as my study showed, directly after, or sorry, this is baseline. And then we see a decrease in power directly after at 15 seconds. This is why this is dangerous. And then we see it goes above he did 8 minutes. That's like the classic PAP study, but like obviously none of us are going to wait 8 minutes for a potentiating effect. Anyways, our optimal load is 40% for the bench throw. It might be 30, it might be 50. Upper body considerations. I don't know if I'm definitely not approaching upper body power development the same way I'm approaching lower body power development. Like lower body is everything I just talked about. Like we got to get strong first. Then we're using these like advanced like dynamic effort methods. Like upper body, we're going to get stronger and I'm going to do explosive throws and like rotational movements. We do plyometric push-ups and we do med ball chest passes at the end of the year for baseball. But you got to think like that's after like 6 months. Like I'm at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
I just really don't think we need to approach it in the same mindset. Where do we go? So one thing I really struggle with power development is, all right, let's say 2.2 body weight squat is really important to me. And my guy hits it. Like, what do I do? Do I just keep training strength the same and introduce more power work? Do I stop training strength altogether? That's just a question that like I've rattled around in my obviously there's things about what I'm going to do, but I think a common method is to then go your strength work becomes single leg emphases, or you decrease the range of motion. Joe Kin, Matt Ray, and a bunch of other smart dudes showed that quarter squatting is effective to improve sprint speed. One interesting consideration with that study is that at 4 weeks it was not effective. So one thing that they say is like you need to be training this like long term to see an effect. That could be an error from sample size or it could be true. Anyways, dynamic effort work. How do we progress this? For me, I do 2 cycles before I change a variation to keep it from getting stale. Because that's my main concern with dynamic effort work or like VBT work is like, all right, are they going to do like 8 months of like 1 meter per second squats? Because we're not going to get a good intent. But what I would do is I would do a wave cycle twice and then change variations. I add complexity. I do like a single leg emphasis for strength, but I would keep a bilateral movement in there to keep high rate of force, singles, doubles, and I would probably cut out range of motion as I went. Okay. So proving you have. So this is maybe more informational for you guys. The last part was maybe like more of a review. Basic analytics. What do we want? I would say these are like the 3 things that a strength coach can really effectively use. Okay, so this is going to be Pearson correlation. So if you go into Excel, it's literally equals Pearson or equals Correl, as in correlation. They're the same formula. It's just in there as 2 different things. R is going to be used. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Anyways, effect size. We've talked a ton about effect sizes. I think this is really approachable. It's just like kind of foreign to strength coaches, right? Like we don't talk about effect sizes when we talk to one another, but it's not hard, and it's so powerful, so powerful. Okay, and then coefficient of transfer we'll talk about, and then how do we present it? Okay, so R. If you look at these charts here, R is essentially the slope of the line. Okay, so this is a 1 correlation, meaning that literally as whatever this x-axis goes up, the y-axis goes up proportionally. So if I add 10 pounds to my squat, I add 10 inches to my jump. If I add 20 pounds, I add 20 inches. Okay. That's what a 1 would look like. We could have a -1, which you're going to see with sprinting. Um, so like a negative slope isn't a bad thing. You just have to have some context. So if it were a -1, that would be as I add 10 pounds, my sprint time goes down 1 second, right? That it's not bad. It's just negative. Okay. We can see as the scatter gets more scattered, we're going to have a weaker slope, and your p-value would decrease with this. Okay. Same here, same here. The R measures the strength and the direction of a linear relationship between two variables on a scatter plot. So if I want to take something and compare it with something else, I'm going to use R. If I want to see how much the squat correlate to power, I'm going to use R. Okay, so think of R as your comparison. So this is literally how I've done it in Excel. Here, I just opened it up so that you could see what I'm doing. And here is the result. So let's say, how much does vertical jump affect club head speed? Okay, well, to 0.29 of a correlation. Again, that's going to look something more like this, right? It's flat, it's scattered, but we're not going to get pretty lines in this industry. Okay, literally, I did equals Corel, the first series, comma, the second series. Doesn't matter what order you do them in. It's super, super easy and approachable. Okay. Now I can go, and obviously our sport coaches are probably not going to like be like, oh, 0.29 R, like that means a ton to me. But you know, you can have this conversation and you can prove that you've developed a powerful athlete, which is the point, right? Effect size. I'm a huge fan of effect size. One of the biggest reasons is to get if you did a study right now and you used R, it wouldn't work. It would not work. Our industry is not going to have access to a sample size large enough to get a scientific significance, right? Significance is based off of variation within the population, and we're going to be using like 10 athletes in a study. You are literally never going to reach statistical significance. It's not going to happen, okay? You would need like 50 people to reach significance. So effect size kind of like works when you don't have that, but it is a different measure too. So I'm just trying to think of the simplest way to describe this, but it quantifies the size of difference between A and B. Okay, so it could quantify the difference between a control group and an intervention group, or it could quantify the difference between pre-intervention and post-intervention, right? That's where we're going to use it. So it could quantify for day 1 of the fall, this was their squat. In day 68 of the fall, this was their squat. And we use effect size to measure the difference. Okay, again, R, we're measuring how much does X correlate to Y. In effect size, we're measuring how much pre to post. What's the difference, okay, of one group of numbers, not two, okay? Basically, we're looking at one intervention and we're saying how well does it work? How well did that intervention work, okay? So what is effect size? We can see here, these are 0.2 is considered a small effect, 0.5 is a medium effect, and 0.8 and up is a large effect. Like what does that mean, right? Well, to give you some context, we're measuring standard deviations. So if you look at a bell curve, 68% of people fall within the main deviation band, okay? Something like 12% are on each side of that. That's one standard deviation out, okay? I don't know if that helps, but one effect size means that we improve them a standard deviation, okay? That made sense to me. I don't know if that helps you guys. An easier way to think about it is if we have an education intervention. Okay. So I make kids read an hour every night, and we're looking at a quiz. Okay. And let's say Johnny improves 12 points. Okay. So he reads an hour every night and he improves 12 points. Well, we know that that means a letter grade, right? Like we know that 12 points takes you from a C to a B. Okay. But sometimes we don't know like EMG data. Like, oh, okay, like you went from 498 newtons to 502 newtons. Is that insignificant? Is that huge? We don't know. So this gives us a way to kind of add context to things by adding a standard deviation. Okay, we can say like, is this improvement actually like meaningful to people that don't understand the data we're looking at? Okay, so again, R, we're looking at does X correlate to Y, and effect size, we're looking at pre to post intervention. Okay, this is how you calculate it. This is like how normal people calculate it, and this is how people in our industry would need it. So you take the mean of pre-intervention, you take the mean of post, and you divide that by your standard deviation. Okay, so let's look at it. Here we have the same data from golf. You can see our averages are here. So our average club head speed went from 86 to 91. That's like a 5.37 difference. Okay, so I'm going to take the, hold on, I wrote this wrong. Sorry. Okay, mean of post minus mean of pre, right? Because we want to see difference. So we're going to have a 5 because we're taking post minus pre, and then I calculated standard deviation, and you can see it's post minus pre divided by standard deviation gives us a 1 effect size. All right. How do you calculate standard deviation? You enter into the cell equals stdev dot p, and then you highlight the entire column. Okay, the entire column. Pretty simple, right? Like it's approachable. That's the point. Is like I want to give you guys tools that are not like space science. All right. Another easy way. This is not very common, but in baseball, I have the data of standards. All right. We know the MLB vertical jump standard is 28 inches because they don't train, right? Like all our guys smoke that. Wattage is 9,900. Again, this is going to be more important for us because we're not talking about displacement of the body. We're talking about power output in a different method. 9,900, and you can see here we are. These numbers, our numbers are actually going to be a little bit inflated because we're not using a force plate, but you know, we work with what we have. And then 60-yard time. Okay, 6.8 is that's not the MLB average, but that's like the scouting like average. Like if a scout sees you run a 6.8, he says you have an average 60. Okay, and so then you just highlight like guys that have met that metric. So we have this person who jumps to 24, or this person that jumps to 26, and we can say, hey, your power is not where we want it to be. Like, you know, we're trying to get you up to MLB standard of power development, and you're not there. And you say the words MLB level of power development, and they're like, okay, yeah, I'm ready, right? So just kind of flashing the bait before the fish. Then proving you have, dig into your own data, like run this stuff on your own data. This is what I was talking about with this 2.2 thing. Like I was sold, I was ready to sell the barbells, right? Because Dr. Mann had me convinced that like we were spinning our wheels and I'm making these athletes worse. Well, then I get into the data and we're looking at relative squat strength. So squat to body weight ratio versus a 60 time. Okay. So not even in a vertical jump, but a 60 time, which is probably a further translation. I think we can agree. Okay. And we're continuing to see improvements at high relative squat strengths. Okay. Like you look at now, if you isolated some of this data, you could manipulate it to say that like, oh, it doesn't work, but we just don't have the sample size right now to know. And actually, I'm going to reach out to Adam, who has 5 years of data at Dallas Baptist, and try and get his to improve this to see if I'm right. But to kind of corroborate this, I did the same thing with absolute squat strength, so weight on the bar with exit velocity, and we see improved exit velocity up to 500 pounds on the squat. Like, I don't know if my population is different, if the sample size is biased, that Jackson Windstrom can hit a baseball 8,000 feet. Like, I don't know what the difference is, but there's a difference in my data, and this is why it's important to dig into your own data. And I hope that you can take away that this stuff is approachable. Okay. And obviously, like, I'm here to help you dig through it. Okay. And then you can set up a correlation chart. I think this is one of the best things you can do. It is a little like confusing to look at, right? Like, what am I going to be looking at in these 25 numbers? But you look for things that surprise you. Okay. So a one correlation, we should have one correlations diagonally across this because we're comparing a 60 to a 60. Okay. So if that's not a one, you've done your table wrong. Right. But if we have any other ones like here, or any very high numbers like here, you should be like, okay, why is that? So why is this a one? Vertical to 60-yard time. And this is like the part of the presentation where you should be like, holy crap, like Dennis has like the magic formula. No, I just messed up the Excel chart. Okay. But like ones, high numbers should jump out at you. So like 0.857, that's a really high number. What is that? Well, that's vertical against vertical wattage. Okay. So that should be high, right? Because it's everything except for body weight. And then negative numbers. Don't be scared, but do think about it, right? So where's our 60? Squat to body weight ratio compared to 60-yard time. It should be negative. It should be negative, okay? Because as you get stronger, your 60 time goes down, right? Time goes down, strength goes up, opposite directions equals negative, all right? Literally, I put in a formula and I dragged it across this chart, okay? Like, I hope this is moderately approachable, okay? And then presenting it, make it look neat. This is golf's presentation, and you can see here I have some of the raw data, and it's easy for golf because we look at two numbers. On the sports side of things, we look at handicap or average score. We look at club head speed. On the weight room side, we look at TPI score, and we look at counter movement jump height or power, preferably power. But for the women, I don't take their body weight for like more cultural reasons. So we just use height, and that's fine. We make the best of it. Okay. So here's all our data. Oh, we improved our driver head speed. Like, that's always a good thing. So, by the way, like 6 miles an hour, you would be like very happy about. That's good. Okay. And then we can look at jump height versus club head speed, and we can say, hey, this does matter, right? Like, for our population, it worked. Okay, it worked. And then TPI, there's like some line. Obviously, like hypothetically, we can agree that it works, right? But is it that strong? Probably not as strong as a counter movement jump, apparently. Okay. And then just look at some health stuff. Say, if we had injury data, that'd be great if we could, get that. But, and then if I had two vertical jumps and I had two driver head speeds, I could do what's called transfer coefficient. But Dr. Zordas actually kind of talked me out of that and said that it was like not a very good statistical analysis. But it's really simple, and I can show you how to do it if you do have pre and post on a weight room number and a sport number. Okay, you could do it, and you could say like, how much does X transfer to Y? Okay, and this is the biggest thing, and this is something that like I still am not good at, but garbage in is going to lead to garbage out. If you don't consistently test, then you're not going to get good processable answers when you run these analytics. If you have crappy testing protocols, if you warm up differently for your vertical jump when you test it, that's garbage in, okay? If you give them different cues when you do vertical jump testing, that's garbage in. And it's going to lead to garbage out, which like I think we can all agree, like we get frustrated with vertical jump numbers. It's like, why is this not linear improvement? Like, why am I not seeing what I think I should be seeing? Well, like, to be frank with ourselves, part of it is because we do garbage in. Like, we don't give the same cues. We don't do the same warm up before vertical jump. Um, so in any case, that's just the biggest thing is be consistent and try to control things.